Hello, and welcome to Inside BSKL, the podcast. This series aims to provide insight to parents from our very own world-class international educators. Tune in as we share experiences, strategies, and the unique dynamics of teaching in a global setting. This week, we will hear the second episode in our series on reading. In this episode, Mr. Antcliffe is in conversation with Mr. Potts about reading skills, what they are, and how we can develop these skills with our students. Let's take a look inside BSKL.
Well, hello, Mr. Potts. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I am great. So we're going to do a little bit of a conversation around reading, the joys of reading, but look at reading skills in particular. Now, I'm really excited for this episode, but before we get started, can you tell us all about your favourite book, please, Mr. Potts?
I'm not well read, I would say. I'm a bit of a stickler for what I like, and I basically just read sci-fi.
Oh, okay.
My favourite author is Arthur C. Clarke.
Oh, yeah?
I think he was the first author that really, as an adult, I had a real emotional attachment to his books. In 2001: A Space Odyssey was the first book I think I read that made me just go, wow. It's amazing, yeah.
And are you a fan of the film? How close is the film adaptation to the core material?
That's fairly close. There's a bit more in the book. But I read the book before I saw the film. I think most people probably seen the film beforehand. So I ended up, just like with everything else, when you see the movie adaptation of a book, I think most people, after you've read it, I think most people think that the movie isn't quite as good.
Okay. It's great. Now, I was talking with Mrs. Whitfield last week, and she was talking about Close Encounters and War of the Worlds, like the War of the Worlds in particular. She's a big fan of that, and it's got a real resonance for her growing up as well. So I guess it's the same with yourself and sci-fi. It's like a recall to youth now as an adult.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Trekkie. I love Star Trek. I love sci-fi. I mean, my son is 4, and my wife was telling me in the car yesterday he got some Play-Doh and put it on a little crest there and said Star Trek.
Oh,
so, yeah.
You must have been a proud father at that point.
That's my boy.
He'll go far in life. Now, Mr. Potts, something I'm really interested to talk about in this episode today is your training history, research and courses you've done, and how you integrate that into your work here at BSKL. So from looking through your CV, I am aware that you're currently doing a master's, and I believe that's got a focus in how to develop reading with multilingual learners. Is that correct?
The master's is in international education, but I have access to lots of academic journals, and just as my interest in EAL, as I'm an EAL specialist, there is quite a lot of research out there on reading with EAL learners, and as it's quite an exciting time to be in international education, as the amount of international schools worldwide is growing exponentially. So there's only more research and more new and exciting programs that are coming out and strategies that didn't exist before.
So that'll be fantastic. So as we're talking through today, we can have the reference point of multilingual learners and students who are perhaps learning more than one language, and how we can help develop their reading skills as well. Okay, great. Now, one thing that I'd really like to delve into a bit more detail with is this concept of the 1,000,000-word gap. I know I've heard you refer to it before in the Parents Academy session you did last year. I wasn't in attendance, but I had a look at the slides, and it's a really interesting concept, and it seems like quite a foundational concept as well. Could you give us a little bit more information about the 1,000,000-word gap?
Well, it was a study that was conducted, I think it was in the 80s actually, and there have been a few more that have come out since then surrounding it, because the claims were quite extravagant. But the whole premise was that if you read with your child every day for 10 to 15 minutes, by the time they are, I think it was 10, they would have been exposed to 1,000,000 extra words than a child that had not been read with. Now, there's probably people out there who are suddenly thinking, but I know that there aren't 1,000,000 words in English. There's about 200,000 approximately. So what it means is that exposure, but then that continual exposure to vocabulary that children need to have for them to properly internalize new vocabulary and to understand its meaning. So it's not enough to hear a word more than once. I mean, one really good example of this is when I was reading with my son, Will, who's 4, was reading a book with him about the zoo. It must have been about 2 years ago. And it was about the zoo at night. And it was talking about one animal that prowls around at the nighttime when all the animals are sleeping. And I just thought that, I was thinking about the million word gap when I was reading it through with him. And I thought that word, prowls, that's not a word that I'd normally say to my son, or that he would be exposed to on TV. And I thought that was really, really quite illustrative of like the power of reading and how reading can expose you to so much more vocabulary.
So it's the repeated exposure that's really key for reading development then. So we want children to be reading often, but repeated exposure to text, is that an important...
That's absolutely integral. I mean, so when my son was... I mean, I've been a teacher for 15 years and I know how powerful reading is in exposing children to new ideas and to new sorts of sentence structures. But when my son was learning to speak, when he could only say a couple of words in a sentence for things he'd request, he could say entire sentences from books, mainly the Julia Donaldson books that we were reading with him at the time. And these sentences would be 15 to 20 words long, and he'd internalize them, and he could actually repeat them word for word in almost the same intonation that I would read to him. And that was, I mean, now he is speaking properly, but at the time I thought that was quite powerful, especially as if he would be requesting, drinks or to turn the TV on, he'd only be giving me sentences that are only 2 or 3 words long.
Okay, so repeated exposure, revisiting texts again and again. So this is good for young learners like your son, but I guess also for multilingual learners. Would you recommend rereading texts multiple times?
I think it's good for anyone, really, because to fully understand an idea, I think most people need to be exposed to it more than once. I mean, that core principle of a writing strategy called Talk for Writing, which is something that I'm very familiar with, and it's a really popular writing program that's used in the UK, is it employs something called the 3 I's, and that's internalize, imitate, innovate. So in order for children to create their own narrative structures, from what they will do is take it from a learned text that's been created by the teacher. And first of all, they would internalize that text so they would know it off by heart. And then following on from that, then they will be able to imitate that text and recreate it in writing before adding their own ideas into it. But the first step in that path and in that strategy is to internalize and to know the language structures off by heart.
Okay, so the 3 I's are really important for developing reading skills and competencies.
That's a writing skill. I mean, this is actually quite, I would say, teaching strategy heavy, and it's not something that I would expect parents to be doing with their doing with their children. But as a core principle in terms of developing ideas and language exposure, that's something that parents can do with their children at home, and it will almost certainly help with what they're doing at school.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Mr. Potts. Now, something that I think is really good to delve into a bit more deeply is reading skills. But I'd like to talk about reading skills as it relates to enjoyment of reading. So in the previous episode with Mrs. Whitfield, we talked about lots of the ways to promote enjoyment in reading. And I guess you have a similar opinion that enjoying the reading process is incredibly important for students.
Well, I think the end result of where we want our students to be is to be lifelong learners and to enjoy reading. And if we haven't done that, then I think we've failed. That's where we're aiming our children to be when they finish primary school, that they're going to be able to go into secondary school as confident readers who enjoy doing it, and are able to internalize and understand a variety of different texts and not need to be supported in that at home. And in order to develop those good habits, then it's really important, I think, for children to enjoy it, because then they're going to be motivated to learn. And without that motivation, that's going to affect everything that they do.
And so as educators, we understand we want our children to love reading. Parents, we're both parents of BSKL students, we know this as well. We want our children to love reading.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit more about reading skills and how they might promote that love of reading? And one thing that really interested me from your Parents Academy session last year is you talked about the 5 reading skills.
Mm-hmm.
So for the remainder of this episode, if we could go into the reading skills in a little bit more detail, and then we could think about how developing reading skills is an important vehicle for developing that love of reading that we want for all our students. So for the 5 reading skills, I believe vocabulary is the first skill. Is that correct?
Yep. So in terms of an order of the depth of reading and the complexity of the questions that you might want to ask children, it's concerned with vocabulary, literal skill and retrieval, summative skills, prediction, and finally inference.
Okay. And then so vocabulary, are we talking here about the 1,000,000 word gap, just building a bigger vocabulary for our students?
That's when you talk about specific word units within sentences. So that might be clarifying with children, what does this word mean? How do you know? Can you use it in a sentence? Are there any other words that have the same meaning? Before we continue, though, I need to really clarify that for anyone who's listening to this or anyone who wants to really engage with their children in reading at home, that there's a really fine line between engaging with your child in reading and then turning it into an academic exercise. And I think if you do turn it into an academic exercise and you're quite stringent and militarized about the questions that you ask your children, then that's going to turn them off. So you need to really gauge it in terms of when you ask children about the questions about text, you are interrupting the flow and the fluency of the story. And I think it's really important to trust your gut in terms of, is this the right time to ask a question, or is the child really, really enjoying it at this point? Should I break?
So you're saying keep it fun. This is
Yeah,
what we should be doing
you have
at
to
home.
keep it fun. We as teachers, we will all, take care of all the nuts and bolts at school in terms of it. But so just as an overarching philosophy on it, I think it's really important to just be aware of the fluency and to make sure it's quite fun and upbeat.
Okay, so we're making the reading experiences for our children fun when they're at home.
Yeah.
And it's good for parents to be informed of the process that's going on at school that informs the skills the children are developing, which will enable them to enjoy independent reading at a deeper level.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about vocabulary. I know one of the other skills is called retrieval or literal skills. So is this literally children being able to answer questions about the text?
So that's answering asking questions that are explicitly answered in the text. So it might be, George was a giant, the smartest giant in town. What was George? Oh, George was a giant. It says that. And you may even phrase the questions in the same way that the sentences are actually structured. That would be for absolute beginning of readers. It's also a case to ask stories about the pictures and the illustrations in terms of literal meanings. I mean, I still talk to my son quite a lot about the illustrations in the stories.
Well, that would seem like an effective way to get the children responding in verbal answers, but without overwhelming them if they're studying on decoding and reading aloud the text. Asking questions about the pictures and the illustrations is probably quite accessible for lots of students.
Yeah, and if your child is still learning to read and is decoding in their big cat books that we give out at school, and the reading books that get sent home from school, they should be able to decode about 90% of it fluently, and then have to be segmenting their phonics with the additional 10%. But if a child is really, really struggling with decoding what's on the page, I would not say that it's appropriate to start asking them about what's also happening, because they're either going to test one skill or another.
So keep it fun, keep it simple and accessible for the students.
Exactly. And just about the literal skills and retrieval as well. It's questions like who, where, what, which, when, and so they're closed questions as well, because the answer's on the page.
And I guess adults and children, they could do this process together of finding the facts as well. So parents can support the process with students.
Yeah, and don't let them struggle. If they don't know the answer, just tell them. It's fine. It's not a test. It's you want to be enjoying the text.
We're keeping it fun. So I know skill number 3 is summarising.
Yep, that's right.
Now, are we thinking about summarising at the end of the text, at the end of each page, the end of a chapter? What would you recommend would be, if a child was reading at home with parents, what's a good amount of summarising to do when reading?
Well, that's entirely up to you. I mean, if something important has happened in the story, then I'd probably want to summarise that section of narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But as a rule of thumb, usually you could do it each page. I mean, personally, I probably don't ask as many questions when I read with my son as some parents do. I like to keep it free and easy. But I would say at the end, I'd say at the end of a story is a good time to ask them what happened in the story, because then you'll be testing their comprehensive skills in terms of them picking out what they thought were the most important parts of the story as well. And it's okay to help them as well in terms of, you may want to give them a few prompts about, this happened and then this happened next as well.
So it could be co-created by adults and students. So as parents, we could be starting the summary and the child could be adding more detail to that summary, and you're doing it together.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. I mean, you might want to summarise, as the children get older as well, you can summarise different ideas or themes that happened in the story as well. So, how many times was this person sad in the story? Can you, why did they keep on being sad? That's a summarising question. Summarising is also interlinked with retrieval as well.
Okay, so skill number 2 and 3 are inherently...
Well, all of these skills are overlapped. I mean, none of them truly exists independently of another.
So that's good to know. So as we're developing one skill, we're developing multiple skills.
Exactly.
And they work together to create more proficient readers.
Yeah. And vocabulary forms the base of it, of course, because you can't break it. You can't break the words down. Well, you can into letters, but then they're just letters.
And I guess at that point, the text is probably too challenging for that child, and we need to look at a more accessible text if they were struggling with too many words.
As I said, if they're reading it by themselves, they should be able to read 90% of it fluently without having to break down or sound out any of the words. But I'd imagine, especially with younger children, that the parent would probably be the person who's, if it's a bedtime story, you'd probably be reading the story to them anyway. So it's okay to ask, as I ask my son when I'm reading with him in the evenings, I'll be asking him a few questions.
Not too many. We keep the flow
not too many
of the story going. And we keep it fun.
Yeah. And also I'm tired and I wanted to go to bed.
Of course, you've had a long day at work.
30 minutes asking him about what's happened in the story.
So skill number 4 is predictions. And we've discussed how all the skills overlap and interlink. So when we talk about predictions, is that just before we start a story? Are we literally picking up a text saying, what do you think is going to happen in this story? Or is it something that can be integrated throughout the storytelling process?
Well, you can predict at any point in the story. I mean, of course, something that I do when I do guided reading with my children at school is we'll read the blurb on the back of the story, and we might pick out some new vocabulary and then or a few keywords, and then ask them what they think is going to happen in the story. What kind of genre do they think it's going to be? I mean, the saying goes that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but it's also a good source of conversation and stimulation before you start reading a story and getting children excited about what the book might be about.
And I guess it relates to the point you made earlier about using illustrations and pictures as a prompt for questioning as well. I guess when it comes to predicting, the illustrations are a really accessible entry point to then say, okay, we can see this character on the page. What do you think they're going to do next?
I mean, I think it's important as well to ask them also, how do you know? Not just, what do you think is going to happen? Okay, great. If you challenge them and, what's made you say that?
So the students should be justifying their ideas, their explanations.
I mean, if you're doing these things at home, I wouldn't say you should be doing anything, because, as I said, we want to keep it free and flowing and relaxing. But it's something you certainly could do. It's something that I do with my students when I want to. I'm ensuring that they've got mastery in terms of their convictions.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. Now, the final skill is one that I've come across many, many times in my long career in teaching, and it's a concept that I've often found quite tricky to develop in our students, and it's the skill of inferences, making those contextual links and basically understanding text and themes at a deeper level. So I'd be really interested in any helpful suggestions you've got around how do you build inferential skills, because they seem like quite high order skills.
In building inferential skills, they need to have a lot of exposure to books, and they need to have they need to be quite adept at reading independently as well, because with an inferential skill, there's quite a lot of the child that's in the answer, because it's their own thinking, their own interpretation of the book. But the most simple form, one of the examples I always give when I talk to parents about it is if there was a child crying in the book, and it might be saying, John was crying, he went outside, and then you ask the child, how's he feeling? Say he's sad. How do you know that? Because he's crying. It doesn't say he is sad. The child knows that when someone's crying, that they are usually sad. That's inference. So most inferential questions will revolve around how or why. And they are open-ended questions, and they can form a lot of really deep discussions with children. I mean, but these are the most it's the most difficult skill to develop, and it doesn't. And prediction is inference as well.
Okay. Oh, so we come back to that concept that they're all interrelated, these skills. So if the students are predicting, they're summarising, they're explaining and justifying their opinions, that all forms part of the inferential process.
Well, yes, because if you're predicting something, you're inferring what might happen in the future based on what you already know.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. It's been fascinating, Mr. Potts, just to get into the mechanics of reading skills. So we've constantly come back to this point that we want reading to be fun. But I guess the more skilled you are as a reader, the more fun you'll extract from the process. So would you recommend developing reading skills as a way to enjoy the reading experience at a deeper level?
I mean, yeah, it encourages mastery and understanding of text. You need to do it. I know that it's really hard to read with your children at the end of the day. And I was a teacher for many, many years before I had a child. And I was always thinking, why are these parents not reading with their children at home? And then I became a parent, and I'm like, oh, right.
I'm the parent of two children. I know you're soon to be the parent of two children as well. Time is a precious commodity.
Exactly. So it does. I mean, I'm sure that Mrs. Whitfield has talked about this, about creating that space and creating that time to read with your children. And it isn't easy. I understand that now. But to develop these skills, you need to be reading all the time. I mean, in the 15 years that I've taught, every single child I've taught that has been a high achiever or has had a lot of academic success has been an avid reader. They've always had a book in their hand. And I mean every single child.
So we want our children to be reading often, frequently. Mrs. Whitfield talked about 20 minutes a day as a recommended time frame. We've talked about the skills that will help the reading process. But I'm guessing now, I'm going to practice skill number 3, summarising here. So I guess in summary, we want the children to be reading lots at home. We want to share that process with the children, keep it fun. And us as parents, we're asking gentle, prompting questions as the children are engaging with the text. And through this process, they'll develop their reading skills and they'll develop that love of reading. And the key thing we want is to build that vocabulary in the students, and the skills will come with that. Have I accurately summarised? Is my skill number 3, is it developed well, Mr. Potts?
Perfect, absolutely perfect. I think it's really important as well to allow the children to read the books they want to read. Now, I know there's quite a lot of children that enjoy reading manga comics and comics and books that might not be traditional chapter books. That's okay. That's fine as well. As long as they are reading some longer texts with a longer narrative, and books that the big cat books that we send home from school will address that. but it's important to allow them the space to indulge in their own free reading as well. And if that's something that you don't necessarily think is going to improve their reading skills, I would still suggest that. Well, I would still assert that you still need to give them that space, because they need to be able to find the genres and the text that they enjoy reading, and they won't develop that love of reading unless they have that space and freedom.
And that personal connection with texts and genres, I'm guessing that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm a sci-fi buff, so all I read now as a adult, or in my free time, if I'm going to read something, apart from journal entries, I'll read sci-fi.
I know as part of the master's course you're doing, it involves a lot of academic reading, but let's just touch on reading for pleasure now, Mr. Potts. You talked about some texts you enjoyed, your favourite books. Are you currently reading anything, or have you got plans for something for the forthcoming holidays?
I'm reading a book called The Long Earth, which is co-authored by Terry Pratchett and Stephen Baxter, but I've not managed to get as far through it as I'd like to.
Hey, this is what the holiday time we can catch up on our good intentions with reading. For me personally, I'm rereading, and you recommended rereading, I think now for the third time, Nelson Mandela's autobiography, A Long Walk to Freedom. So you talked about yourself being a sci-fi buff and that being your genre. For me, it's biographies. I really love learning about inspirational people. And for me, none so inspirational as Mandela. So I'm rereading Long Walk to Freedom at the moment. And I mean, it's a text that's really rich and dense, but there's new information that's coming out as I'm now reading it for the third time.
Oh, third time.
Yeah.
But there comes the internalizing a text, and if you reread something again and again, you find something new. I think each time.
Well, Mr. Potts, thank you so much for your time today. We've talked about keeping the reading experience fun at home. We've talked about the skills that can be developed through the process of reading at home. I guess the takeaway message is, in school, we're focusing on these key skills, we're developing these key skills. If any additional work on these skills can happen at home, it's really beneficial for the students, but we want them to be reading and enjoying the process and finding their own love of reading.
And just one more thing before we finish as well, just for parents who don't speak English, that's fine for you, and your child is at the school and learning English. It's okay for them to read the book in English to you, and then for you to speak to them about it in your home language.
Okay. Oh, that's really interesting. So the two languages can work together to improve the child's comprehension?
And that way you're still able to engage with your child about their English book at home.
Oh, well, that's fantastic advice. And thank you so much for that, Mr. Potts.
My pleasure.
It's been an absolute joy to talk through reading skills and get to know your personal reading habits and likes a little bit more. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.